Hi guys, I'm Jen Welch. I am a permanent makeup artist. Today I wanted to talk to you about iron oxide pigments versus carbon pigments. There's a time and a place for each of them. Carbon pigments are derived of smaller molecules and they are really easy to get into the skin, and they're actually a little bit easier to get out of the skin as well when you do removal on a carbon pigment based tattoo. Carbon pigments tend to fade only about 5 to 10% after the initial procedure upon healing. Carbon ink shows basically every mistake you make when you do a bad tattoo, basically. But carbon pigments also, if done correctly, can produce beautiful, vibrant, healed results. I recommend only using carbon-based pigments if you're an advanced artist and you've stopped making mistakes with your shape, your details, and you really know what you're doing before you begin using carbon pigments with your permanent makeup procedures. If deposited too deep, carbon pigments can sink even farther into the skin and turn gray or blue. They can be corrected, usually with an orange or a red-based ink. Carbon-based color, when used correctly, can produce beautiful results and stay for a very long time, and only fade just a tiny bit over the years, but it will never go away. Generally, you don't need as many passes when you use carbon ink. I recommend only saturating lightly because carbon ink can actually saturate the skin really fast, and it can get really dark and too saturated so that there's no more room in the skin for any more ink. So it's best to saturate lightly. Carbon inks can migrate and blow out super easily. Remember how I was telling you about how carbon was made up of tiny little molecules? Well, the saying goes that carbon ink has legs and it will run. So be incredibly educated and know what you're doing before you use carbon inks. I would use carbon-based pigments in the following situations. If you're an advanced artist and you no longer mess up your line work, your shape, or your details, and you want to maximize your working time, use carbon. If your client has a darker skin tone, if your client wants the most permanent solution with vibrantly healed results, if your client loves the look of dramatic dark makeup, for clients with thicker and more oily skin, and for most eyeliners, and I mean most because in some cases you would want to use iron oxide for the eyeliner, especially if the client has very vascular eyelids. Iron oxide pigment. Iron oxide pigments are more of a semi-permanent ink. Iron oxide actually is made up of larger molecules than a carbon ink, and so it takes just a little bit longer to get into the skin during a procedure, and transversely, when trying to remove it, it might take a little longer to come out. Iron oxides are mostly true to color, and they do not tend to overly saturate the skin, at least in just one session. Multiple pigment packing sessions create longer lasting, more vibrant healed results. You may need more passes to accomplish the color and the desired saturation that you want with iron oxide pigments. Iron oxide does not migrate and it doesn't as easily blow out. It still can blow out, but it does not migrate like carbon does. These pigments tend to fade about 35 to 40% after the initial procedure upon healing, and they do tend to fade a bit faster over time. You do sometimes need an additional pigment packing session to complete your desired result. When used incorrectly, iron oxide pigments can fade into a reddish orange color. But the plus side about that is that it's easy to correct. You can use a green-based brown to correct it. You can even throw green over it and it would turn it back to brown. So it would be an easy fix. I would use iron oxides in the following situations. If you're a beginner and you still make mistakes with your line work, details, and/or shapes. If your client is super fair-haired and blonde or redhead. If your client is a super natural individual who does not like the look of a lot of makeup. If your client is super nervous about getting her first session of permanent makeup, you can explain to your client the differences between the carbon and the iron oxide inks and why you're choosing to use iron oxide on her, because it has a better chance of fading. So she's more confident that her face will basically be the same over time. If your client is older and has very thin, dry, wrinkly, or crepey skin, this would be a good time to use iron oxide pigments on her because her skin will drink that ink right up. and it's super easy to go too deep on an elderly person. So using iron oxide on an elderly person is a wise choice. Also, it's incredibly important to remember that when you're doing eyeliner, if your client has incredibly vascular eyelids, this is a good time to use iron oxide and not carbon. If you use carbon, those legs might run underneath the skin. So remember your whys, and there's a time and a place for iron oxide and a time and a place for carbon.